So, John, this has been very interesting to do this exercise of revising the exhibition through the glance that you have or the vision that you have over the catalog book of the exhibition, despite the distance between us. First, the distance between Colombia and the UK, and also the possibility that we have of seeing the material remotely. But it calls my attention, the first observation that you made, if I understood correctly, is that this genealogy, in all the cases, not only for you in England, but also for us in Colombia. So those of us who have participated in this exercise of building a genealogy, you said that it is very determined by what the historians have told us of the history of English architecture. So I understand that that's what you said. And according to their own reconstructions of the homes of old cities, many of them that were, we have the photographs, they're been restored because they are no longer there, but those are guided by the criteria of the historians. But I would like to focus on a topic that we had to definitely limit and we did not include in our exhibit. But you mentioned at the end of your intervention with the photograph of Bailey, that house that is in the Welland Museum in England, about the arches, and something that we did not include, and I think is key, and maybe I wanted you to mention later on. It's a topic that Natalie Joy, the historian, in the book about the English house, refers to and highlights, which is the role of the structure of the hall, especially the middle hall. So to finish, I want to say the following, which is that effectively the exhibit, and of course, we are very limited with our didactic goal of allowing a general comprehension when you introduce these variations and interpretations to the reading that we make during the exhibit. Thank you, Andres. First of all, I have to thank John for your patience and your willingness to participate in this activity. It's a pleasure for me to meet you, and it's a pleasure to listen to your valuable observations that we are keeping record of, especially taking note of the diversity and variety that the architecture of the UK already has in its origin. We're talking about the local variations here, but it is very interesting to see precisely what you said about the existing enormous variations and possibilities that there are for the implementation of those English patterns. The perception that you have also calls my attention about the cultural and architectural encounter that we studied in the adaptation of the Sangrabs and the Anglophile architecture, as you call it, in a country that was not a direct colony of England. There, you can confirm the transfer of curious information that is much more cultural. So there are many of the topics that you mentioned with regards to the materials, to the timber in the structure, that we will, of course, continue listening to very carefully. We also heard the critical observation of Antonio talking about the lack of matices or differences that goes beyond the isolated home, which is included in a more adequate way if we talk about the blocks of houses when he talks about the morphological structures. Also, the patio comments are insufficient. So we assume a little bit unconsciously that there's the proper place to have these. But I think it's key to understand in a better way the contrast that there is among them. Anyway, the comparison between the historical colonial sector and the parts of the city of the English barrios or quarters are very revealing with the change of paradigm that is announced in our catalog and our exhibit, especially because it makes evident the spatial traits of all those models and the succession that is studied from the colonial house, the Republican house, the Casa Quinta, before coming to the modernity, like Patricia described. So this allows us to approach the different ways in which a society acquires spatial and cultural values that are from another country that can be in those models and remain, survive, and also overlap in a city that's typically Latin American, like Bogota. Yes, I would also like, first of all, to especially thank Professor Goodall for his presence and comments that are very valuable for us. And we're very interested in them because you're showing your interest about our work and the architecture that has been developed in Bogota, specifically about the interpretations. I would like to make a summary so that we can discuss in the following moments with respect to what Professor Antonio said about the two possibilities that we see in the modern houses of Bogota. One that has to do with the stylized version of the English house, where the hall is more a space as a articulating area that, as Goodall said, without doubt, is a dignification of that hall or that threshold. And on the other side, the modern house where the hall becomes like the living room that, as Professor Goodall said in a previous intervention about this space, it becomes more specific for meetings and it's no longer a multifunctional space. So if it's possible, I would like to hear if effectively in the modern houses that we try to illustrate in our exhibit, we notice those two types of approaches about what we see in modern houses in Bogota. On the other hand, I would also like to say as summary that the importance of photography, as it was mentioned by Timothy, but also to see it from 2 points of view. I would say that without doubt, the photography and the publications that come from abroad are a reference, especially filtered by the US, become a reference in the influence of modern language with a traditional plant, as John has mentioned. In other words, there's a standard of life that is very traditional with the domestic service, which is practically half the house, but now has a modern language. However, the photographs, especially those from modern houses of Bogota, as we try to show in the exhibit, show that standard of life where the domestic service practically doesn't exist. In other words, it's a house that is fundamentally represented in its social spaces. And that house is practically without people in it. And the photographs, as John said, are ideal because they don't allow to show that actual way of life of the stratified Bogota or the Bogota with that social stratification of the domestic services. And it's more like a US house. And that is why the idea of the local appropriation is no longer there. And so I wanted to comment that.
Thank you very much indeed. I feel I must say, first of all, how delighted I am that it's been possible to see these buildings. They're things, I feel as though you see this as Bogota and how it's looked to Britain. But for me, I'm completely fascinated to see that there's a whole sphere of architecture in Bogota which has used, sort of borrowed English ideas, but used them as a starting point for a completely different evolution. And I find that absolutely fascinating. And I feel it highlights my own ignorance of how, British architecture has been borrowed and used and turned to completely different purpose. I think it's amazing and makes me feel I definitely need to come to Bogota to see some of these buildings. And I'm embarrassed that I was unaware of them before. Give particular emphasis to is the point in way raised at the very end, that we are seeing a common arc in the evolution of these hall spaces. I mean, they are one and the same thing at one level, but viewed in another light, they are totally different things. I think I've said before, but to re-emphasize, I think that studying architecture in this very formal way is abstracting it. but it's a really valuable means of looking at architecture. It does illustrate things that you might not think about if you simply saw all the buildings that have been illustrated in these talks. If you saw them one after the other and walked through them, you might not necessarily see the connections that you can draw between them if you choose to use this prism of formal analysis of plan. The English buildings that we started off looking at in the 14th century, they do belong, goes without saying, to a totally different social and political and aesthetic world from what has happened later. And I mean, Andres, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that what is actually being what we've seen in what I've seen of the houses in Bogota, it's actually people borrowing ideas in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, and almost seizing on a moment of historiography where those buildings of the distant past, the medieval past, are coming under the lens of popular and public attention for the first time properly since they were constructed. So what you're actually seeing is not really an evocation of medieval halls, but an evocation of how the late 19th century understood medieval halls. But bound up with them, again, I think it's an incredibly important point in a way, the appreciation of history in Britain, which I think there's always been an appetite for history and an interest in history in the world of architecture. But I think the idea that historic houses could be luxurious and fashionable homes is something that is very much an invention of British sensibility in the mid 19th and late 19th centuries. So what you're seeing is in fact an export or a borrowing. It's not an export. I think that's important to make. It's people in Bogota and architects and patrons in Bogota seeing what's going on through publications and choosing to respond to it. This is not in any way a reflection of British outreach, active outreach. As has been said by Victor, this is, Bogota is never really under direct British influence as a colonial possession. So this is a desire on the part of the people there to borrow these ideas. And that's fascinating. And it speaks to the ability of particularly the British press, the architectural press, to publish ideas and make them globally available. And of course, in the exhibition catalogue, you reproduce images from Muthesius. It's fascinating that it's not just Bogota that's looking towards Britain. It is, as I've said before, it's there's global interest in what the British are doing. The British aren't really interested in exporting those ideas outside their own empire, but other people are really interested to see what the British are doing. So what you have, I think, is a sort of fascinating borrowing of history, but turning it to a totally new purpose, and one that is capable of reformulation within the modernist movement. What a fascinating change. I think we always reflexively in architectural history see 1939 to 45 and the Second World War as a real break in our national architectural story. It's certainly the moment in Britain when the union of modernism and classicism and the classical tradition somehow breaks down, that modernism strikes off in its own direction independently. But in fact, curiously, what you seem to have in Bogota is a situation in which those, without the prism of the war, those two traditions in a curious way do blend together. But I would very much agree with Patricia that it's through an American lens, curiously. So yet another overlay through the photography and so forth, another connection that further enriches this transposed set of ideas and forms. So I've learned an enormous amount by looking at this material. I'm enormously grateful and feel very privileged to have been asked to speak. But thank you very much indeed, and I'm delighted to have had the opportunity to think about this material. I should know it much better than I do. Thank you.
If you would like, you can make a question. But John, I would like to know, in my intervention, I would like to know your opinion with regards to the specific aspect that I highlighted about what Nathaniel Joy refers with the role of the cover structure in the consolidation of the Great Hall in the medieval architecture, and how, well, that would be the first part of the question. And then I would like to make a comment with respect to the interpretation, because in the next meetings, maybe on Friday, we are going to be with Neil Jackson, and we're going to be seeing with him how there can be some houses that have medieval homes of double height that are very impacted by a medieval structure. And that is a conversation we're going to have with Neil later on. So maybe you could be with us as an attendee to the meeting. But anyway, I would like, John, to know your opinion, whether in this case, what Nathaniel Joy mentions in his book, The English House, is it real? In other words, the role of the support structure had a great impact in the consolidation of the great medieval hall and the role that this hall had from then on.
Gosh, it's a complicated question, isn't it? And it implies all kinds of theoretical understanding of what that means. If I understand, the problem correctly, I mean, the hall is, in all kinds of ways, a product of structural necessity. And this, the detail that actually you mentioned earlier, this use of arcades inside halls to support roofs, which ironically all the buildings we've been looking at have done away with. That is, that clearly is a way in which the structure of the building has dictated the building form. But I think there are other ways in which, of course, the hall is not a product of structural necessity. I mean, haven't really talked very much about it, but in an English context, the placement of hearths, fires in the middle of the hall, it's clearly, it's not a necessity at all. It's simply how you design halls. In fact, I think you could pretty confidently say that even by the 13th century, the only English interior that would have had a hearth in the middle of the room is the hall. So there is, I mean, but that said, the other great feature of halls, the open timber roofs and their structural form, I feel they do become a leitmotif of English hall design. And I think it's very important to say in that regard that in England there is a special tradition of timber frame architecture born of the prolific availability of oak as a building material that encourages really sophisticated use of timber frame from a very, very early date. And the great hall roofs that we have in Britain are virtuosic essays in timber framing. They're how you create roofs and encrust them with carved detail. So it's structurally ambitious because the spans, particularly when you take away those arcades, the spans are very ambitious, but they incorporate lots of carved ornament and detail. And indeed, it's worth saying that in relationship to Penshurst, there is a very interesting conceit. If you imagine in the 1340s, you are an Englishman or an Englishwoman familiar with seeing great buildings, and you walked into Penshurst Place Hall, you would be astonished at a roof with the span that you see today. You would have expected it to be supported with intermediary supports, but also you would have looked at the sides of the roof and you would have seen these curious life-size carvings of figures groaning under the weight of the principal timbers of the roof. And if you look at the photographs of the hall, you can see these figures. All of them are sort of with pained expressions, as though they're bearing the burden of this enormous timber on their back. And that's a joke. They're peasants and farmers, and they're holding up this roof of extraordinary scale. So I think you always have to be aware of the ways in which medieval architecture is, you can analyze in all kinds of ways, but to remember that there is also a playfulness in much of this material. I sometimes wonder, indeed, going through round houses, today with architects, some of them, not all of them by any means, but some of them are so serious about what they do. And I think that that little intervention of playfulness is a reminder that ultimately architecture is a little bit about joy too. So we should never be too formalist or too serious about it. I hope that sort of answers your question and not too frivolously.
Yes, John, thank you. I think maybe Timothy wanted to add something. We have 5 minutes maximum
Well, actually,
until we end this call.
there's only one a brief point I'd make there, John. Thank you very much for that. There's a lot to think about. But on the subject of playfulness, of course, we know that the Edwardian architects, and certainly Bailey Scott among them, absolutely introduced it back into the houses. There's that house in Letchworth, which I illustrated in the Edwardian houses, where it has a little creature sitting on the newel post, and there are other ones at Lymm Castle, for example, by Lorimer. They brought back the playful element of it in that period, and it's probably not a coincidence that it was also one of the golden periods of children's literature. There seems to have been something, as Andrew Saint would say, something in the water, which means that connection of very sometimes rather puritanical ideas about structure should be mixed up with a great deal of fun. And country life, as you know, specialised not only in very well, as you know better than most people, not in combining very logical and rational arguments for the restoration of buildings, often including the figures, the costs, the return on the investments. On it combined these with pictures of children splashing through water and so on. It's a very clever combination of the charming and the rational, which I think has a great hold over the public imagination. But I think that's all I would say. Thank you, Andres.
Victor, you had a question? Yeah, more than a question. I want to make an invitation to John, because tomorrow we're going to be insisting about an issue that I think that is very important regarding the transfer of that cultural information between the UK and Colombia, and it's the specifics of the Bogota treat, because it's not easy to find such a specific case in which there was that dissemination that was extended in the interest for those architectonic values of the England. And that was part of the initiation of our investigation, because we wondered, why did that happen? How can we explain having this curious interest of people in Bogota? Because we realized that this is not like an anecdote, because it had an impact and a very important extension in the city and also throughout time. So that is what I wanted to say. I think that it is very interesting to see how John tells us that we loaned a type of a jewel or a kind of a kit of architectonic ideas with which the Bogota architects in the 30s and 40s started to play and to recreate and have fun with those values. And that was it. So this is my invitation to see if you can join us tomorrow also. Thank you. We have 3 minutes. If anybody else has any intervention, or John, if you want to close by wrapping up, or if somebody from the curatorial team wants to make a question. John, you have anything else to add? We have 3 minutes left.
I have 3 minutes. I don't know. I suppose all I would say is it's tremendously stimulating to juxtapose two such totally different traditions or geographically removed sets of buildings, and to see the common themes that are between them. I mean, it's a really remarkable thing, as Victor says. I mean, it's, this does happen otherwise, but it's the consistency of the borrowing. After all, again, in the Edwardian period, where people begin to be interested in having houses in Britain, they become interested in having houses where every room has a different style. This is not this is not the same thing. This is consistently going back to a particular point of reference, and that's a very unusual thing. And it's so interesting to see how how the prism of context and lifestyle, how they change architectural ideas, that there is no straightforward borrowing, that you are always reinventing your sources. Nothing is new, but by the same token, no two things can be exact copies of each other. So it's a really fascinating essay in the transport of architectural ideas at this particular moment in the 19th century. And I'm quite certain that Alan and Neil, who will be speaking after me, will have much more incisive thoughts about what this means in a contemporary tradition of architecture and how that you can be picked up in contemporary things. But for me, it's been fascinating to look at and to think about. And I'm enormously grateful to be included. And I'd like to extend my thanks to everyone for their patience with my failure to speak Spanish, and how fascinating it's been to hear these ideas relayed to me. Thank you very much indeed.
Yes, thank you, John. So this is the end of our session for today. Thank you to all the attendees. So we invite you tomorrow to our second day of workshop, where we are going to have Alan Powell as our guest. And we hope also that John can join us in our meeting tomorrow. Thank you all. And we will be seeing you tomorrow. Bye-bye.